Hi there, my name's John Stuart. I'm one of the Friends of Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and with me here today I've got a former colleague and nurse director from the Royal Infirmary between 1996 and 98, I think. Welcome, Margaret Smith.
Thank you.
Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thanks for agreeing to be part of the web seminar and the series of events for Women's Week within Glasgow Royal Infirmary. I'll maybe start by asking you just to give us an overview of your early career within nursing and why you chose nursing as a profession.
Thank you, John. I guess when I reflect on that particular question, I think maybe lots of people would expect that I always wanted to do nursing, and choosing to train as a nurse and obviously coming here to the Royal was a last minute decision, and I left school with no real clear idea of what I was going to do, and had a gap year as a waitress, and then thought, well, I need to do something. And one of my friends was coming here, and I then ended up in Glasgow Royal, training to be a nurse.
So it could easily have been Edinburgh Royal?
Absolutely. It could have been anywhere.
Okay.
But it just by chance came here.
Okay. So you did your training in Glasgow Royal, and then you progressed to registration and your early post as a staff nurse?
Yes, so I completed 3 years training here in the Royal, and then midwifery training, and I then pretty quickly decided I wanted to do intensive care nursing, and I went off to Edinburgh and completed my training there, and I stayed there for a bit and worked in cardiac intensive care. And then I had the opportunity to come back to intensive care in the Royal, and I was there as a staff nurse and then as a sister from, I think, probably 83 to 87. And then in 87 I left and went to the Victoria Infirmary, still initially in intensive care.
Okay, so you've left the Royal, you've gone to the Victoria Infirmary, still in intensive care. The next step is then to where? Still in the Victoria Infirmary?
It was, and I think in that period, which was the very early 90s, 91, 92, the health service in the UK was going through really radical change, and we were moving into the purchaser-provider, the establishment of trusts, and I'd gone back to university, but I was also in a position where the NHS in Scotland were looking for the potential cohort who would become the first directors in trusts, and they were inviting individuals, both from medicine, nursing, finance, to complete an accelerated fast-track graduate programme. And that's what I did. And the Victoria Infirmary at that time was one of the pilot trusts, I guess. And I became director of nursing there in, I think, 93. Mm-hmm. And then I came back to the Royal in, I think, 96.
Yeah. So that's the time that I remember, because I think I remember Rachel Wiley as the matron.
Yeah.
And then Isabel McKinlay coming in as matron stroke nurse director, because that was the time when the titles were changing. And then at that stage, Isabel retired. Now, I should say that Isabel was going to join us here today, but because of the COVID travel restrictions imposed on Friday, that kind of knocked that in the head. So a bit disappointed, and Isabel herself was disappointed because she would have liked to come down and share her stories. So Isabel retired, and it was at that stage that I was aware of Margaret Smith from the Victoria Infirmary, nurse director, putting her hat in the ring, because I'd just come out to do a bit of project management at the time. Yeah. So that's really when the first time when I met you. So you were successful, obviously, in that application. I would ask, what you were already in a nurse director position in a big teaching hospital in Glasgow. What pulled you over to the nurse director post within the Royal Infirmary?
Well, again, and I maybe should pay tribute to Anne Jarvie, who was the chief nurse at the time for Scotland. And I always remember Anne, who is a Royal Infirmary stalwart, calling me to say, "You'll be aware Isabel is retiring. We expect to see your application." And so there was that, but I guess obviously it was progression as well.
Mm-hmm.
You were going back to a bit of your roots, and becoming director in the Royal was prestigious, one of the big hospitals in Glasgow, and that's why I came back.
I always remember Anne Jarvie referring to the Royal Infirmary as her alma mater.
Yes.
Yeah. So who were when you came back to the Royal in your capacity as nurse director, who were the big characters round about then?
Well, I guess another sort of milestone, I think, at that time was we then moved into the implementing clinical directorates. And so I came back as director of nursing, and on that day, Bill Anderson became the medical director for the Royal Group. And Bill had been my former colleague in intensive care,
of course.
And so that was pretty exciting. And you were really then sort of moving into, I guess, the cut and thrust of the clinical directorates, and identifying the individuals who are going to run them, lead them from a medical, nursing and from a business perspective. But it was also really, I think, trying to make sure that some of the principles of general management were then being embedded in the directorates.
So Bill Anderson had taken over from, I think, the current chair of Friends of the GRI. Ross Lorimer was the previous medical director.
Yep.
Ross retired, and then Bill came in. Yep.
And I think the privilege then of working with individuals who, I guess, were steeped in their own sort of clinical specialty, but also in giving leadership to, large, busy, prestigious hospital, was a really exciting time.
So as we move into trust status, what were the big challenges facing the Royal Infirmary at that time?
So I think you then probably need to set it in the context of Glasgow. And we had, obviously, I think during that time, you've got huge demands in terms of healthcare. But Glasgow had far too many hospitals. Clinical care was changing in such a radical way, where more and more was actually being completed on a day case. So ambulatory care, outpatients, individuals didn't actually need to come in. And we had too many hospitals, too many beds. They were too old, and it needed radical transformation. So I remember these discussions well, because again, if you look at the context of the Royal, in Glasgow at that time, there were 4 individual trusts.
Mm-hmm.
So you had 4 fiefdoms. And I also remember one of our colleagues saying to me, Margaret, you have to understand the Kelvin runs deep in separating the north and the south and the east and the west. And so that was quite challenging. So each of these fiefdoms probably believed they were top dog.
Mm-hmm. So, and I tell this story, I always remember the time when the decision was made that we would move to one trust north of the river, and that the Royal Infirmary would merge with Stob Hill Trust and the Western Trust. And a meeting was convened in the boardroom, and the clinical directors were all asked to attend. And Ian Hutton was the clinical director for medicine, if you remember. Yeah. And Nigel Clifford, who was the chief executive at the time, explained the position and the government direction, and this is what's going to take place. And he said one of the first challenges is we need to call ourselves something. And Nigel Clifford quickly chipped up and says, "I suggest we call ourselves the Titanic, doomed to fail."
Which is probably a really good illustration of how individuals were
Sure, yeah.
so kind of committed to their own little patch.
Of course, yep.
Yeah.
So turning to nursing as a profession, and your role as nurse director, what were the big challenges facing the profession around that time in the kind of mid-90s?
Yes, so again, I think it's probably looking at the context of care. So if you look at how, we were moving to more ambulatory care, more day care, more care in the community. And I think all of that then brought the need to radically transform nursing. And when I reflect back, for me, I think there's probably, a number of milestones, but we had some really early developmental work at that time in maternity, because the same thing was happening in Rotten Row, which was part of the Royal Infirmary Group, and moving to develop community midwifery models and to really cement the independence of the midwife. And with Mary McGinley, who, again, another stalwart of this group, we secured funding and established the Midwifery Development Unit. And a lot of the research that came out of that clearly demonstrated the efficacy of midwife-led care. And then similarly, I think in terms of more general nursing, the work, and Mark Cooper, Derek Nelson particularly, in accident emergency, looking at the development of the emergency nurse practitioner, because they were probably the kind of early parts of developing independence in nursing. So setting up minor injury units, and the work that came from that, I think, then really cemented early advancing nursing practice, independence and roles in nurse practitioners, clinical nurse specialists. And it was a really exciting time, because I would suggest a lot of that work then influenced practice, not just in Glasgow, but across Scotland and in the UK.
Sure. So I suppose the current model that we have around minor injuries, for example, is an illustration of that early work that was done, clearly the preparation and the development of those emergency nurse practitioner roles gives us the workforce that allows us to develop minor injuries units, which now are nurse-led, as you know. And then, I suppose, subsequent to that, we then had the development of independent nurse prescribing, and that gives you the more rounded and absolutely independent practitioner. Okay, so having moved on and nursing, the development of roles and a new role as the nurse director for the North, you then decided what was the next step in your career?
And again, it's probably an evolution of my career, probably was consistent with the changes in Glasgow. And from North Glasgow, we then became a Glasgow nursing, or a Glasgow service in terms of healthcare. And that, I think, was around probably 2003-04. And I was then director of nursing in the acute services. Yeah. So acute and primary were then separated, I think, and with one leadership at the board then influencing all of us in terms of how we progressed. And at that time, we were then probably in the throes of the implementation of how Glasgow's healthcare services was actually going to be established, with new ambulatory care units being built, and then the new hospital at the Queen Elizabeth.
Okay. And from there, you then decided to move away from the acute sector and move into higher education?
Yeah. It was, again, it was chance. And I had a telephone call one day from Professor Irene Lee, who was the head of the College of Medicine, Nursing and Dentistry in Dundee. And they were going through, again, sort of fairly significant change. And they had decided they wanted to appoint a dean who came with significant leadership background. If you came from leadership and through an academic route, that was absolutely a bonus. But for them at the time, the leadership was critical. And I was invited to apply, and again, within a couple of months, I was leaving Glasgow, commuting up and down the road to Dundee, and thinking, oh my gosh, what is this? What have I done? And I spent 10 years in Dundee, and it was fantastic.
I mean, I would have to say that is a major feather in your cap, because back in the day, it was highly irregular for universities to go to operational health, as you were, and bring somebody in. So I think you were absolutely against the grain in that respect. But clearly you were sought after, I would imagine, if you received the call.
Yeah, I think I was pretty lucky, and being able to work for Irene was just incredible. She's probably one of the most visionary individuals I ever worked for. But I am aware that kind of initial reaction was, oh my gosh, an NHS manager is coming to be the dean. Yeah. This is just the last thing. But it was actually interesting that by the time I left Dundee, there were 10 deans, and half of us probably came from a practice background. So the Dean of Law had been a practicing lawyer, and obviously medicine and dentistry had come in from practice. And that was really encouraging.
You set the trend there in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I then was fortunate by the time I retired that I was the dean and I was a deputy principal in the university leadership team. And I think it demonstrated to other colleagues you can actually move. And a number of nursing deans have now come in from practice.
Sure.
So that's good.
I know we'll finish up, but I know that the Royal Infirmary holds a special place in your heart. If I could just ask you one final question, what's the lasting memory of the Royal Infirmary that you'll take away with you?
Well, I was asked this question fairly recently, and I personally will never forget coming to the Royal on the Sunday afternoon, and you're reporting for starting your training on the Monday morning, and it was October, and it was dark and smog or fog, and I'd come down from Stornoway, you realise. So it was pretty different, driving or coming up Castle Street in dark winter and thinking, I will never survive 3 years here. This is just a real challenge. And then when I reflect back and think, oh my gosh, I spent nearly 30 years around this area. So I think back to that, and then I think back to the opportunity, I guess, the Royal Infirmary gave me. And I guess the platform it then gave me to move to influence nursing, not just in Glasgow, but across the UK as well. And the incredible friends I've made over that period. It's a pretty good place to be in. You bet.
Okay, Margaret, I think on behalf of friends of the Royal Infirmary, and indeed some of your colleagues, former colleagues who still work here, we extend our thanks to you for agreeing to be part of the GRI Women's Week celebrations. So, Professor Margaret Smith, thank you once again.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm pleased to say that our second guest is Dr. Joanne McPeak, who is probably one of our previous guest proteges Joanne is a nurse consultant. Joanne, welcome.
Hello.
So I think, like Margaret, we'll maybe start with a general question about how you found yourself into nursing first and foremost.
Well, interestingly, I had quite a similar journey to Margaret. So I had planned to go and become a teacher at University of Stirling. So that's where I'm originally from, just out of Stirling. And I was accepted, and I was going in the August. And in the May, I thought, that's really what I want to do? And all of a sudden, I seen clearance places for nursing in Glasgow at Glasgow University. And I thought, do you know what, I quite fancy that. I could do that, I think. So I applied through clearance. I was only 17 at the time, and usually they were looking for people 18. But I phoned, it was Di Carter at Glasgow University, who was looking at the admissions for the next year. And I had a telephone interview with her. And she said, look, I think this is the right thing for you to do. So I then took up a place at Glasgow Uni. And I did my 4 years. I did my honours degree there, and quite a bit of my training was here in Glasgow Royal and at the Western Infirmary. And that was...
So you could have been a head teacher?
I think that would have been a mistake for so many people in this world if that's how it had ended.
Okay.
Yeah.
So once you qualified from Glasgow Uni, your first post was in the Royal, was it?
It was. So my first post, so one of my second last placement was intensive care. It was Old 25 in Glasgow Royal with Bill Anderson and Ellen Malcolm and Lelia Dunn were in charge. And I hated it. My first week, I absolutely hated intensive care. None of the patients could talk to you. There was nurses that had 4-colour pens. You know, they had all different colours of pens. I didn't really understand which colour went where. And then as I got to know what intensive care nursing was, I got to know the staff and how the staff worked and the care that you got to give a patient. I absolutely fell in love with intensive care nursing. At that time in Glasgow Royal, the general trend was that you went to a ward and did a year or two in a ward, got your ward experience under your belt, and then you applied for a job in intensive care. But again, it was as chance would have it, there was D-grade posts were coming up, and I remember Lelia Dunn came and spoke to me and said, I think you should go for one of these jobs. And I went for one of the jobs, and it was Ellen Malcolm that interviewed me for that post, and I got a D-grade, and I started again with Anne Wynne as the clinical service manager. It was 2004, so it was round about when this service expansion was happening. We were moving to surgery and anaesthetics at that point. That's when I took up my post in the Old 25, and my first week, so I think it was towards the tail end of my first week as a D-grade staff nurse, was the Mary Hill explosion.
Oh, goodness, right.
It was the Mary Hill Plastics. So that was
Yep.
my first week in post in Glasgow Royal Infirmary, one that I'll not forget.
Baptism of fire.
Yeah.
So I remember the names are familiar with me, and Alec Millen and the likes, these guys
Yep.
were all round
They were
about
all
that
there,
time.
yeah.
Yep. Okay, so you've got your D-grade staff nurse. Just take me through then how things progress.
So D-grade staff nurse, and then did my competencies, did the in-house critical care course that was set up by Margaret. And then I moved to, I think it was kind of the following year, 2005. Again, an E-grade came up. You had to wait in these jobs to
Sure.
come up. An E-grade came up, and again, I was in a really fortunate position. I had just finished my competencies, had finished my critical care course, and I moved and got an E-grade post. And I've got to say, probably at that point, I was absolutely firmly, I wanted to be a charge nurse, I wanted to be a senior charge nurse, I wanted to be kind of that role, that clinical role in intensive care. But as all this was happening, we had the Scottish Patient Safety Programme landed in Scotland, and we were absolutely kind of leading the way in that internationally. And I got involved in it, and I've got to say, I kind of went into it. It was Malcolm Daniel was leading the way in Glasgow Royal Infirmary in intensive care. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure how this will pan out, but I quite fancy getting involved in it. And I took on the role as leading the central line implementation bundle, and how can we make it that infections aren't just part and parcel of what we do? How can we make it that infections are a never event in this unit? And I worked closely with the Scottish Patient Safety Programme and Malcolm and a whole team across Glasgow, and we eradicated central line infections from our unit. We eradicated ventilator-associated pneumonias from our unit. We were going 500 days at a time without one of these infections, and when we did, it was a big event. You know,
Sure.
It was why have we got an infection now? And for me, that absolutely changed my perception of what I wanted to do, because I wanted to make different changes to patients. I wanted to think differently, and how do we make widespread change, and how do we implement it so that patients all get this? And that's when I went and did my Masters at Glasgow, and I did the MSc in critical care. So I very much firmly specialised in critical care, and did part of the Scottish Patient Safety Programme kind of bundle implementation as part of my Masters. And it was at the end of that, and I was still in E grade, or it had flipped because we had Agenda for Change had came in at that point, and I flipped to be a band 6 at that point. But it was at the end of my Masters, I went and did my research module, and at first I thought phenomenology and get all these big long words that I had absolutely no understanding of. But by the end of my Masters, I absolutely realised this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to do research. This is how I'm going to make an impact on patient care. And then I moved forward with research.
So what was your dissertation about as part of that Masters?
Oh, don't.
Because I'm asking the question because I'm conscious that Joanne McPeak was a name that I kept in my career hearing about. Never knew you, but I'd heard about Joanne McPeak's research. And there was a star in ITU, and it was Joanne McPeak.
Well, you're going to laugh at this. It was
Okay.
about bowel care.
Okay.
It was about. So I was known as the bowel nurse in intensive care. So we had a couple of significant events in intensive care where bowel care could have been implicated in them, and we could have probably improved things if our bowel care had been better. So I worked with the consultant body and our nursing colleagues and our dietitian colleagues, and we implemented a protocol to try and improve patient care and reduce constipation, make sure that everybody's documenting it, and we did a before and after study. And what we showed in that is that you can improve outcomes by improving really fundamental nursing care. So it was about bowel management in intensive care, and it's really interesting because people laugh at that, but I got that published in 2011, and everybody references that one study. So this study that's published from 2011 from bowel care, but I learned a lot from that project about good research processes and about the importance of working with a multidisciplinary team, not just about the clinical implementation, but how do you build strong research? How do you build really good, rigorous research? And I learned a lot from the colleagues in ICU that I still work closely with.
Mm. And that kind of kicked you on, again, further on down the academic pathway into your PhD.
Yeah, so at that point, I was kind of at a crossroads. What do I do here? And I decided that I wanted to stick with research. So something that's very close to my heart and always has been the social determinants of health, and I think that's why I've continued. One of the reasons I've certainly continued to work in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And we have a not insignificant portion of our patients come into intensive care because of drug and alcohol problems. And I was really interested in trying to kind of support these patients more. So 2011, I think, I started my PhD. I had, again, with the support of people like Margaret, I was lucky enough, I was awarded a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship, which was a travelling fellowship, and I was able to go to America for 5 weeks and look at how they support their patients, both in the ICU and after the ICU. And I went to Boston, and I went to the IHI in Boston for a few weeks, Texas, Salt Lake City and Nashville, and looked at areas of excellence and areas of excellent practice. And then I came back and started my PhD looking at how do we improve the pathway for these patients. And I did that. I did it part-time. I did it over 4 years. I still worked in the ICU doing it, and I took on a bit of an academic role at University of Glasgow and worked really closely with Anne O'Neill, who was another GRI nurse by background, who was my supervisor, and John Kinsella, as well. It were my two supervisors, so I was really, really lucky. But it was through my PhD that the wider part of recovery from ICU came just flashed before me. That we spend sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds looking after patients in the intensive care unit, and then we literally see them at the door of intensive care and think our job's done. And what the PhD showed to me is that we send people home to the start of a really, really difficult time. And again, I knew at the end of my PhD that that's what I wanted to take forward.
Okay. So I'll maybe come back to that in actual fact, because that's currently a lot of the work you're currently doing relates very much to that. But if I could just go back, so I was speaking to Margaret, and the role of the matron, transformed into the nurse director, and advanced nurse practitioners coming on. The nurse consultant role was new and came in around about the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Just give it, some of our friends may not understand that particular role because it is new to many. So what are the component parts of that nurse consultant role?
Well, there's the four pillars of all advanced practice, but it's very similar within a nurse consultant role. So there's a clinical part to it, there's a management part to it, there's a leadership part to it, and there's an education part to it. And they can differ in their weights, but that's more or less the whole component of a nurse consultant post. So I'm really lucky in that my nurse consultant post is specifically about research and quality improvement and quality assurance. So my clinical role is still in ICU recovery, but I also take on clinical roles in quality assurance and understand how we continue and continuously improve patient care. And I do all sorts of education. So I'm really, really lucky in that I get to do education across the multidisciplinary teams. So whether it's undergraduate medical students, undergraduate nurses, I teach physios, postgraduate nurses as well as in-practice education as well. And then the main part of my role is the research bit of it, and using research knowledge to, again, not just do research and practice, but to promote an ethos of evidence-based practice for nurses in clinical practice.
Going to be a wee bit controversial. I mean, and this has been a challenge for me in my previous role. How do we keep research up the agenda when nurses will say on a day-to-day basis they struggle trying to secure the time that they need for direct patient care? Because
we make it part of patient care, and that's how we do it. And we make it part of the patient care agenda, and we do research that makes people's lives easier. So a lot of nursing research to date, and not in a critical way, has been quite separate from what we do. It has been almost, right, we do our day-to-day job, we've got our patient care, and research is over here. But actually, how do we improve our day-to-day job? How do we make our day-to-day job easier? And that's where nursing research will play its part, and that is where nurses will absolutely lead the way. So if I think about my most important bits of research, and the research that have been embedded best, if that's the right word in practice, it's been the bits of work that not only change the way patients are treated and improve the way that patients are treated, but makes everybody's life a bit easier, makes everybody's life better. And I think that's what we've constantly got to keep in the agenda. It's not separate, it's about improving how we deliver healthcare.
Sure. You'd said, Joanne, that some of your work got you looking at the aftercare, so the care of patients following intensive care episodes. So that takes me on to the internationally recognised and acclaimed INSPIRE project that you're currently involved in with Tara and the team. Could you maybe speak to us a wee bit about that work?
Yeah, so at the end of my PhD, I knew again, I know what I want to do now. I want to really change how we look after patients after intensive care. And again, just as I was finishing off my PhD, Mags McGuire was in her CNO role. She was doing an acting post at the CNO, and Mags in that role, CNO for Scotland, introduced with the CSO of Scotland some nursing fellowships for clinical academic nurses to go for 3 years, have a clinical role but also an academic role. So again, I was really lucky to be awarded one. There was 3 of these awarded for the whole of Scotland, and Glasgow was lucky enough to get one of those. And I knew at that point I want to change how patients are leaving intensive care. At the same time, we had some evidence actually coming out from Edinburgh, some more international than that, saying that ICU recovery programmes don't work. We can't support patients, or we don't yet know how best to support patients. But if you looked at them, they were quite linear in what they did. So it was one profession would maybe go and see them a nurse-led clinic, or it was all done in hospital and we didn't actually see the patient going home to their context. So we decided that we would bring together the entire multidisciplinary team, and that wasn't just our in-hospital colleagues, that was health and social care integration. So having, financial inclusion there, support for our caregivers, support for housing, support for, different facets of getting back to work and things like that. So it was a massive undertaking. And we decided we wanted to run a programme based on all of this, all of our learning about ICU recovery. And one of the things we also knew that was really important to patients was peer support. So we wanted to run it as a peer support health and social care model. And we were told umpteen times, you're not going to be able to do that. That is not feasible. Setting that up in acute care, you need to go out to community to do that. And we were saying no, because this is about their intensive care journey. So there's no point in having it out in the community because people want to come back to intensive care. It's a massive gap for them. They want to learn about that. So we set it up and the first clinic ran in September 2014. I think you were just about in post or were coming into post. And only 3 patients turned up on the first day. And I remember we were like, oh my goodness, we can't run this. But we kept at it and we used all the QI skills we had generated through the SBSP programme. So we learned, right, why aren't the patients coming? Right, let's do something about that. So 80% of patients have delirium in intensive care, and we know that can affect long-term cognition. So when I phoned up the patients and said, look, you were meant to have an appointment at 2 o'clock today, they went, forgot, you'll need to phone me up and remind me. The following week, we doubled the number of patients that turned up, and it was small tests of change like that really led to it. And then we ran it for a year, and lots of patients turned up, and we showed that we made a big difference to people's lives, and their quality of life improved, and they just felt better, and their caregivers improved. More people got back to work, and it was all from actually listening to patients. And we had. Just to go back a bit, we had set up a patient and family council. It was the first in the UK and first patient and family intensive care unit council. So it was a group of patients and caregivers who had been through intensive care, and we brought them back and said, how are we going to make this work with us? And I mean, in true Glasgow Royal style, the patients and families were absolutely brutal. So one of the nurses in the unit had made up a poster for outside the unit that had a patient with all the lines and tubes in it and all that. And I mean, medical illustrations had came. I mean, this was a work of art, this piece. So we gave it to our patient and family council, and they went, that's awful. And I was sitting like, oh my goodness. And they said, where's the family? Where's the seat where the family can sit? Where's the nurse? All the stuff that actually makes it better, all the stuff that's going to comfort us is missing out of that poster. And what creating Inspire and that patient and family council has shown me, and it's about the wider research agenda, I suppose, is you can only do that by listening to patients and actually get them fully embedded in the process. Just like we need to get staff fully embedded in the process, getting patients and families embedded in that. And that's a process that we've kept going. And I think when we've seen research work for us, it's because they've absolutely ran right, they've got a spine right through it, the patient and family voice.
And I suppose just considering the current situation that we're in and coming through the pandemic, that Inspire model is probably more important now than ever.
Yeah, so we've moved it to a virtual format, which has its pros and cons, because I think we miss how much the patients speak to each other, that peer support, and we'll try it on a virtual basis, but it is a bit more difficult to get that human connection virtually. But we've now seen all the level 2 and 3s in Glasgow. We set up a Pan Glasgow clinic for that, and I think it's been humbling hearing some of the patients and the families' experiences. But we've also extended out that model to bereavement as well. So we've spoken to some of the families who loved one didn't make it out of the hospital, and that was really challenging because intensive care, we really pride ourselves in the care that we provide for families and loved ones, and we weren't able to do that in the way that we would have hoped during the pandemic. So the Inspire models helped us kind of support families, and that's looped right back round because that's really helped the well-being of staff and understanding how the families are getting on as well.
You've still got a long career ahead of you, Joanne, and I'm at two minds whether to ask the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So where do you see yourself, say, in 5 or 10 years?
It's the $40 million question, isn't it? So I absolutely love Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and I can't see myself moving away from Glasgow. And that sounds like I'm saying that because of where I'm sitting today, but it's not. I love the patients. I love the staff in this hospital. Do you know, I was down at Mabel McKinley's, which is a famous gastro delight that we have in the Royal. And a porter whose family I've looked after in intensive care was in the queue, and I was standing chatting away to him. How you doing? How's your family? How's your brother? And all that was great. And he went, and can I have a rolling pie, please? And I says, 2021, and you can buy a rolling pie in a hospital. And he was like, I know, nurse, I know, but it's one of the days. I just need a rolling pie. But the worst bit was he went, can you remember put extra salt on that for me? I thought that you could only find that at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and you know, nobody walks past you in the link corridor. Nobody walks past you. Everybody will try and stop. Even people that are having a terrible day will try and stop and chat to you. And I think we've also got a patient group that want to give back. In this hospital, that I've been to different hospitals elsewhere in the world, and patients want to help, and patients want to help other patients. You go up to a 6-bedded bay and any of the wards, all the patients are trying to help each other, and that's a very
Sure.
And I don't know if I'll get that anywhere else, and that's not somewhere I think I want to leave.
Pie, a rolling pie, part of a GRI staple.
I used to be a vegetarian, so I was like, that was happening 2021, Scotch pie and a crusty roll.
You were talking about your earlier study. We'll finish up, but I've got a wee anecdote myself. You spoke about your work around bowel prep and bowel study and whatever in ITU, and I always remember Liz Curry, who was a senior charge nurse, an old sister in ED with Derek Nelson, as Margaret spoke about back in the day, and I remember going to Liz Curry's retirement, and she rehearsed. She'd just moved from the Gatehouse, which was the old ED, up to this new purpose-built facility at the bottom of the parade, the new ED department, and she was saying the space is phenomenal, and Liz was saying, I'm used to working in wee cubicles where you could scarcely swing a cat, and the cubicles were divided by a kind of partition and a yellow nylon curtain. And she says, and we used to do strange things back in the day. She goes, for example, for all the encephalopaths that would come in, we would give them a bowel washout in the department, and then we would transfer them up to medical receiving, which was my ward at the time, when they would get 2 bowel washouts a day. And Liz was telling the story about the time when she had surprised to learn that a third-year student nurse who was just about to qualify hadn't done a bowel washout. And so she said, well, we'll get the procedure manual out and we'll do a bowel washout. So they're in the wee cubicle with the yellow nylon curtain closed over. And everything's all prepared. They've got the plastic dross sheet, they've got the basin. The patient's in the left lateral position. As I say, they can barely swing a cat, but they're managing this bowel washout. And the student nurse is pouring, and Liz is holding the funnel, and everything's fine, and then they're inverting, and everything's fine. Hold, and invert. She goes, and after about the third inversion, she looks at the wee student nurse, and she's a bit unsteady on her feet and ready to faint. So Liz said, I just quickly grabbed the funnel off her and said, listen, dear, go to the duty room, get yourself a cup of tea or a drink of water, sit yourself down. She said, I find myself in this narrow cubicle with the jug, the funnel, and the patient in the left lateral position. So I popped my head out and I said to hubby, excuse me, would you mind coming in and give me, oh, no problem, sister. So he comes in and I hold the funnel and he pours, hold, and then we invert. 2 or 3 inversions and everything's fine. So I then said to hubby, if you give me that now, if you go outside, I'll tidy up your wife, you come in, you can sit with her. And he said, that's fine, sister, but that's not my wife. I'm in with my boy, he's away getting an x-ray. No. So that was back in the day. So there's so many changes. We hear about Caldecott and patient confidentiality, and that's the situation that we were finding ourselves in, 20, 30 years ago.
You need to, if you're interviewing Clegg Imrie, you have to ask him about some of the things he made that the nurses in the old 25 do with TED Stockings and NGI outputs. That will put hairs on your chest.
That's for another day. Joanne McPeak, it's been great speaking to you again on behalf of the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, the Friends of Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and indeed your current colleagues. Extend our thanks to you for being part of Women's Week. Thanks, Joanne.
No bother.